Well, good morning, everybody. Good to see everybody this morning. We are in Luke chapter 6 this morning, and hopefully we'll make it all the way into 7, which is why I've handed out Luke chapter 7 handout. So, yeah, well, can you hear me any better now? Okay. I'll try to speak up. In what, there we are. Now it's nice and clear. Okay. Your battery is not so good? I can hear you now. Oh, okay. Well, we are in a section of Luke that is sometimes referred to as the Sermon on the Plain, which is similar to the Sermon on the Mount. These are two different instances, but of course, as we've gone through, we found that there's a lot of similarities. There is a section that's talking about the Beatitudes. We see a lot of very similar teachings when it comes to the, loving your enemies and all that kind of thing. There's a lot of very similar things, even going down to the section that's talking about taking the speck out of your own eye. Down in verse 41, just again to read and remind us about where we are. Why do you look at the speck that's in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, brother, let me take out the speck that's in your eye, when you yourself do not see the log that it's in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to take out the speck that's in your brother's eye. For there is no good tree which produces bad fruit, nor, on the other hand, a bad fruit which produces good fruit. For a true tree is known by its own fruit, for men do not gather figs from thorns, nor do they pick grapes from a briar bush. The good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth what is good, and the evil man out of the evil treasure brings forth what is evil. For his mouth speaks from that which fills his heart. I kind of categorized this, or labeled it, I guess, as teaching about teachers, because most of these things do have a little bit to do with how one, the warnings about teaching, I guess, and this, of course, is one of them, about taking the speck out of your own eye. As it's talking about this, what's it really talking about? I'm not looking for anything brand new or rocket science or something here, but what's it talking about? Hugh? Okay, sometimes it can be gossip. At other times it just has to do with being, well, what is sometimes, the fancy word for it is censorious. But basically what it means is being nitpicky in a lot of regards, just kind of looking for things to criticize. And part of the reason that Jesus brings this up is because so many of the Pharisees who styled themselves as being teachers of the ignorant. We're going to help you out. Let us show you the righteous way, blah, blah, blah. Oftentimes would end up focusing upon the minutia, the very small things of the law and trying to hold everybody else to that standard while at the same time sinning egregiously with regard to other things. As an example, you might remember that Jesus criticized the Pharisees for tithing mint and cumin. How big are mint and cumin seeds? Really pretty small. But they would be going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, one for God. 1, 2, and if you got a big bag or a big thing, that's going to take a while, okay? But they were in the habit of tithing mint and cumin, but Jesus says you're ignoring the weightier matters of the law, like justice and mercy and things of that nature. You'll even recall that Jesus criticized them sometimes for basically cheating widows out of their homes and property and so forth. All of these things said, this kind of ends up saying, look, if you're going to be a teacher and you're going to be kind of looking for nitpicky things in somebody else's life, what should you first be careful to do? Take the log out of your own eye. Take the log out of your own eye. This is not to say, of course, that maybe some of the things that the Pharisees were saying weren't true. They probably were in some cases. Now, sometimes you might recall Jesus ends up criticizing them because they were trying to hold people to the traditions of men rather than to the law, and that was a problem. But, observing Sabbath or even tithing for that matter, there's nothing wrong with those things. It's just that you need to be careful to not make your entire religion on the easy things to do and not the difficult things. And I think there's something useful here for all of us. Because, for example, it might be easy for a Christian to be steadfastly good at attending worship services. Is that a good thing? Of course it is. But on the other hand, Monday through Saturday, maybe they're doing things that they really shouldn't be doing. Things that would be sinning egregiously, whether it's cheating people or, God forbid, engaging in some sort of sexual impropriety or something along that line. You see what I'm trying to say. It's easy sometimes to focus on the easy stuff and ignore the stuff that's a lot more difficult to conquer. the stuff that they really needed to be kind of paying attention to. The whole purpose of kind of coming together is getting spiritually strong enough in our lives so that we don't end up doing the big things, right? But hopefully you kind of see the point. They oftentimes were, putting it another way that Jesus put it sometimes, straining at gnats and swallowing camels. Not paying attention to the big things, while they are, on the other hand, were trying to focus on the minutia, the tiny little things. You know what I'm trying to say? Okay.
Psychologically, the devil has a tool because so many of us feel that if we can step on somebody else, it makes us stand a little bit taller.
That's true.
Nothing is further from the truth.
Yeah.
It's like the one friend turning to the other and saying, you know, all the world's a little strange except me and thee, but there are times that I have my doubts about thee.
Yeah, yeah. It can sometimes make us feel better if we can find something to criticize about other people, right? And I kind of suspect that in many cases that's part of the reason why it is that sometimes people become censorious, hypercritical, that kind of thing, is because they're really, that guy's really bad. Look at all the bad stuff he does. And now I'm feeling better because I don't do that stuff, you see, whatever it might be. So Jesus is saying that we need to be sure to get the log out of our own eye. And he mentions that not doing this is really nothing less than hypocrisy, trying to make other people believe that we're something that we are not. And there's great encouragement to us as teachers, but even beyond all of that, great encouragement to us just as Christians who, whether we're behind some sort of podium or not, do we teach anyway in our everyday lives? Of course we do, by the example that we lead, right? So just a good thing to keep in mind. Well, it goes on, and again, this is still in the category of teaching about teachers. He talks about how it is that there is no good tree, verse 43, no good tree which produces bad fruit, nor, on the other hand, a bad tree that produces good fruit. What sort of tree do we want to be? The good kind, right? And what's the easiest way to tell what kind of tree something is? Take a look at the fruit. Now, if I were a botanist, I might say, well, take a look at the leaves and take a look at the bark and whatever else. But really the easiest way for most of us to figure out that these trees out here happen to be oaks. But the easiest way is to see, okay, they shed acorns. Okay, all right, it must be an oak, right? Or up in New England, there's a lot of apple trees. And I don't have to take a look and know what the leaf looks like. If there's apples underneath it, I'm guessing it's an apple tree, okay? And so the idea that Jesus is trying to get to here is that if we're asking we know what kind of tree we want to be, so what kind of fruit should we be bearing? Good fruit. All right, so what is good fruit? Okay.
It's fruit that is usable, that has some purpose.
Yeah. And usually fruit kind of has the tendency to mean the deeds, the outcome of your life, your actions. The idea is that in the same way that a tree bears fruit, so also a life ought to bear good works. But if on the other hand, to kind of use this illustration, if I'm claiming to be an apple tree and I'm producing thistles, am I an apple tree? Well, no, I'm not. If I'm producing figs, am I an apple tree? Well, no. And Jesus' very simple test here is that, you know, you want to be a good tree. And so you want to be having good deeds, or especially in the case of a teacher, what kinds of fruit do teachers usually end up bearing? They're students, but they get there by the teachings, by the words that they end up using, right? Hugh?
Well, when I start wondering about that, I go to Galatians 5, 22
Right.
23.
Right.
The Spirit is this. It's pretty explicit.
Yeah, it is. And all of these things, this fruit of the Spirit ends up being love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, and so forth. But these are all deeds, but they could also, in large part, be words, kind words, joyful words, peace-loving or peace-making words, that kind of thing.
My mother always, there were 3 girls in my family.
Uh-huh.
Pretty is as pretty does.
Well, that's right. That's right. And of course, a lot of that was sort of made famous by especially the Forrest Gump movie, right? As stupid is as stupid does. But it all fits, right? It still fits because Forrest, in the case of Forrest, and just kind of using your illustration, Forrest wasn't the smartest person in the world, but one of the messages I think throughout that entire movie is that Forrest may not have been the brightest bulb on the marquee, but he made lots of good decisions. He did a lot of good things. He did a lot of smart things. And kind of ended up, I don't know, making a lie out of the notion that he was really kind of dull. Yes.
I think that a big part of the point of the Forrest Gump story was that even though he was academically disadvantaged,
Yeah.
he was self-aware, and that becoming self-aware more and more is the aim of becoming more mature spiritually.
Uh-huh.
To be able to evaluate ourselves, how we think, what we think, and what we do as a result of what we think. We need to be aware of that constantly.
Yeah.
Because that's the only way that we can be a good fruit tree and produce good fruit.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the other things that again Forrest Gump kind of ends up showing is that again, though he was mentally challenged, still he apparently had been taught the difference between right and wrong, about duty, about loyalty, about things like that, but kindness, because these were all things that he ended up manifesting in his life, right? And these are the things that made him, in comparison to a lot of other characters in that show, wise. And his life turned out better. Now, I realize this is all fiction, and you can write fiction any way you want, right? But I think the point nevertheless is still there. You don't have to be a genius. You don't have to be a Harvard graduate or anything else along that line in order to be able to make a decent life for yourself. And the key to it, honestly, a lot of it is right there. One of the things that in Psalm 119, which is like the longest psalm, it has like 176 verses to it or something like that. Right in the middle of it, it ends up talking about how it is that God's word, he says, make me wiser than my teachers. Isn't that an interesting sort of thing to say? And yet it's true that if we are living by God's word, that a lot of times we're going to live a wiser life, a better life than other people will, because the wisdom is all there. If you're following through and reading the Bible through in a year, we just finished reading through Proverbs, and I was once again, I am every year, impressed all over again with the wisdom that happens to be found there. The stuff that it lays out that, this is the wise course, this is a not so wise, this is a foolish course. And pointing out that, wise men seek instruction, and they even appreciate correction, for crying out loud. Fools, on the other hand, despise instruction. They hate being corrected, and it shows up in their life. Anyway, the point at least here is that we want to produce good fruit. Getting back to the text here, we want to produce good fruit, and in doing that, we certainly need to be careful about our words, careful about our deeds, because our words and our deeds, these are the things that tell us whether we're an apple tree or not. You follow the point. Our words, he goes on to say, actually will tell the world what happens to be in our hearts. As a psychologist, or someone who practices counseling, I've been taught to listen very carefully, because people end up telling on themselves a lot by the things that they say and the attitudes that they carry and the attitudes that they articulate when they're talking to you about things. You listen carefully to that sort of stuff, what the scripture here is saying is really true. We speak out of the stuff that's in our heart, and we tell on ourselves sometimes a lot, just by the things that we say and the attitudes that we reflect. So, a good man or good teacher brings out good treasure, good teachings. A bad man brings out what? Bad words, false teachings, bad attitudes, all those sorts of things. We can tell what's in a person's heart by what we say. Well, he goes on now, starting in verse 46, chapter 6, verse 46, with what I'm kind of, labeling now, what are you going to do with all this? And this is the familiar story of the builders and foundations, the wise man who built his house on the rock. Verse 46, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? Everyone who comes to me and hears my words and acts on them, I will show you whom he is like. He's like a man building a house who dug deep and laid a foundation on the rock. And when a flood occurred, the torrent burst against that house and could not shake it, because it had been well built. But the one who has heard and has not acted accordingly is like a man who built a house on the ground without any foundation. And the torrent burst against it, and immediately it collapsed, and the ruin of that house was great. He starts off by saying, why do you call me Lord and do not do what I say? What does the word Lord insinuate? The guy who's in charge. The guy who's in charge, that's right. We oftentimes, in America, in democracy, we don't even have a whole lot of problem being disrespectful toward the president of our country sometimes, right? So we're not used to this idea of someone necessarily being in charge, You're not the boss of me, blah, blah, blah. But in the ancient world, they understood these lines a whole lot differently. And I think sometimes it would be useful for us to understand these lines a little more sharply ourselves. Jesus says, why do you call me Lord and do not do what I say? What's he trying to get across here? And what kind of lesson do we need to be taking here? What do you think? Yeah. The things that a Lord says are not suggestions. They're not broad outlines of things that you could do if you felt like it. If you happen to be a Lord and you give a command, the assumption is what? It will be done. Because I'm not above him. I'm not even an equal to him. I'm beneath him. And Jesus is saying, if you call me Lord and don't do what I say, you're lying about calling me Lord.
You're gonna get fired.
Well, yeah. Maybe more than one way, yeah. So yeah, it is important to understand that if, in fact, Scott gave me his song list for this morning, and we're going to be singing, Jesus is Lord. Well, what are we saying as we're saying Jesus is Lord? And I, among other things, when he speaks, I need to salute it. I need to be doing it. It's not up to me to question it. It's not up to me to modify it. It's not up to me to assume it's a suggestion. It's up to me to do it. He goes on, of course, and tells the parable about the wise man. And I do think it's important that we pay attention to what he says in verses 47, 48. Everyone who comes to me and hears my words and acts on them, I will show you who he is like. And then he tells the story of the man who digs deep, starts his foundation on the rock, and then builds his house. And then when the torrents come, and by the way, this sort of thing happened on a fairly regular basis. We see it, it's happening in Vermont a lot these days with all the rain that's come their way. But when the torrents come in Israel, they have a lot of what they call wadis. Do you know what a wadi is?
Creek, or gully.
Yeah, it's a dry creek bed. Whenever it's not raining in the dry season, it's dry. But when it rains, oh my goodness. In some parts of Israel, there's not just a whole lot of vegetation to stop the water. And so when it comes, it comes in a big hurry. And if you have built your house in the wrong spot and it's really been raining pretty hard, well, your house, in fact, could get washed away, just like we see in places like Vermont or other places around that have too much rain. But he says, in that kind of a situation, that man's house stands firm. He says, on the other hand, if you end up being the person who, verse 49, the one who has heard, oh yeah, I heard you, Jesus, but has not acted accordingly. Let me tell you who he's like. He's the guy who builds on the sand, at least in Matthew chapter 7. That's what we're told. In this particular case, he just says that he didn't build it on solid ground. So when this guy ends up having a torrent filling up the wadi and maybe threatening his house, what happens to this guy's house? Right down the river. There it goes. It's all gone. What's Jesus trying to say with this parable? And for example, what's the torrent in this parable? Could be judgment. Could be judgment.
Could be life. Life is not always going to throw us perfect situations, right? Both builders experience the same weather.
Yep, that's right.
It's how you deal with it.
So his point here is that we need to, when he says, call me Lord, obey my commands, that we need to obey the commands, because if we don't, then life is going to be a whole lot harder. Certainly judgment is going to be a whole lot harder, for sure, because we've not obeyed the command.
Park, I see one other parallel to that in the previous topics we were just talking about.
Yep.
What really makes a tree healthy? It's the root system, right? It's the foundation, if you will.
Yeah.
So it's like those two things kind of have a similar thought.
It's true. It's true. You don't see the root system, but it needs to be healthy. You can't see a man's thoughts, but they also need to be healthy in order to be able to produce the right kind of fruit.
Be ground and rooted, and if it's not, then it just withers away, floats down the river like it says. It has no foundation.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Psalms 1 talks about being like a tree planted by the water, stuff like that.
Right?
Points out the fact of how, it is on shaky ground or whatever type of ground, it's like a shadow that blows away.
Yeah. True.
It has to be painted.
True, true. All right, any other thoughts about chapter 6 and the Sermon on the Plain? Let's move on to chapter 7 then. Let's read down from starting in verse 1 down through about verse 17. When he had completed all his discourse in the hearing of the people, he went to Capernaum. And a centurion slave who was highly regarded by him was sick and about to die. When he heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders asking him to come and save the life of his slave. When they came to Jesus, they earnestly implored him, saying, "He is worthy for you to grant this to him, for he loves our nation, and it was he who built us our synagogue." Now Jesus started on his way with them, and when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying to him, "Lord, do not trouble yourself further, for I am not worthy for you to come under my roof. For this reason I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you, but just say the word, then my servant will be healed. For I also am a man placed under authority with soldiers under me, and I say to this one, 'Go,' and he goes, and to another, 'Come,' and he comes, and to my slave, 'Do this,' and he does it." Now when Jesus heard this, he marveled at him and turned and said to the crowd that was following him, "I say to you, not even in Israel have I found such great faith." When those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health. Soon afterwards, he went to a city called Nain, and his disciples were going along with him, accompanied by a large crowd. Now, as he approached the gate of the city, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a sizable crowd from the city was with her. When the Lord saw her, he felt compassion for her and said to her, "Do not weep." And he came up and touched the coffin, and the bearers came to a halt. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. Fear gripped them all, and they began glorifying God, saying, "A great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people." This report concerning him went out all over Judea and in all the surrounding district. In this section, starting in verse 1, we end up seeing a story about a centurion. But all this is happening in Capernaum. First of all, where is Capernaum? It is on the Sea of Galilee. It is, in fact, kind of up here where I'm kind of, making a circle. If you can see it, it's kind of up at the northern end of Capernaum. And this is where Jesus had gone. And what's a centurion? Just so we have all of our definitions intact here. What's a centurion? He's a Roman soldier. Yeah, he's actually, technically he's over 100 soldiers, which sometimes was 100, sometimes was less, sometimes a few more. But nonetheless, that's why he was called a centurion, because 100 in Latin is century. But But he was, I guess you could call him something of a, almost like a sergeant in the army of sorts. You know, the officers usually give orders to the sergeants, and the sergeants then make it happen among the troops. And that's kind of what centurions were. But centurions also, especially if they were particularly responsible, could sometimes be given, you know, relatively important positions. And apparently this may have been happening with a centurion. He apparently was a man of some considerable wealth. How do we know that? He had servants, number one. What else? Hugh? He built a synagogue for them. This was no small thing. This would be a big deal. And by the way, what nationality was the centurion? Likely Roman, which means he wasn't Jewish. Okay? So why is this Roman dude building a Jewish synagogue? Because he believed in God. He was what the Jews of that day and time referred to as a God-fearer. He was someone who believed in the one true God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he also believed in the law and was trying to live according to the law. It's just that he had not completely converted to Judaism. He had not gone through the whole process of circumcision and so on and so forth. But he was a believer in God and a good man, one who loved the Jewish nation and had built their synagogue.
Well, he sent Jewish elders and they were willing to speak on his behalf, so that
Right.
says a lot.
Yeah. Here was somebody who had made a number, apparently, of contributions and was well appreciated by the leadership of the Jews in Capernaum. What does Matthew 8, verse 6 say was wrong with his slave? He was paralyzed. He was paralyzed and in great pain. So we don't know exactly what happened to him, but it sounds as if he had some sort of a terrible accident that perhaps had broken his back or something, so that he was paralyzed in great pain, and perhaps in pain enough that they thought that he was going to die. Now, as a general rule, were the Romans and other Gentiles particularly concerned about the lives of slaves? So what else do we know about this man?
He had compassion for his servant.
He was a compassionate guy on top of it all. So when a slave is hurting like this, he wants to do whatever he can to try to help him out. So he ends up sending a delegation of some of the Jewish elders to come ask Jesus for help. Why were they willing to do this for the centurion? We already said it a minute ago. Well, he was a good guy. He loved the nation. He had actually built a synagogue and that kind of thing. So Jesus decides to go ahead and come. But as he's approaching the house, what does the centurion now do?
He sends someone to intercept Jesus, tell him, in essence, I'm not worthy for you to come under my roof, but I know you can do what I've asked of you from where you are.
What do you suppose the centurion's motivation was for sending these friends and saying, you don't need to bother coming to the house. Just say the word. What do you suppose was his motivation?
He understands that Jesus is really busy in his ministry, healing and teaching others, and he doesn't want to feel like he's intruding.
Yeah, probably understood that he was a busy fellow to begin with, but he also knows and understands that what's the deal about going to a Gentile's house? A good or bad thing? That was not going to be a good thing. That was going to be kind of a bad thing, because if you went into a Gentile house, you were probably going to get defiled in some sort of way. And apparently the centurion knew this, understood this. And so he was even wanting to spare Jesus not only the trouble of breaking into his busy schedule, but also saving him the embarrassment, as it were, of going into a Gentile home. Because the expectation was going to be that when you came into the house, that you were going to lay hands upon the person who was to be healed. That was generally the way that it was done. We even see this, by the way, in the story of Naaman, right? Where that Naaman comes to Elisha's house, and Elisha says, he sends his servant out and says, go dip 7 times in the Jordan River and it'll be all right. And what did Naaman respond with? Yeah, he said, among other things, I've got cleaner rivers back where I came from, and I was expecting the prophet to come out and wave his hands and call upon his God and maybe put his hands upon the leper's spot so that it would be healed, and so because they were used to the idea of laying hands on something so that it could be done. This was very, very common throughout not just the Middle East, but throughout the Mediterranean. Yes.
I think too, it's a subtle acknowledgement of his subjugation to the man he knew was the Lord.
Yeah, yeah.
And so in order to show that, it was like, I'm not worthy for you to come to my house.
Yeah, yeah. True. Yes.
There are several instances. What did Jesus say in response to what this centurion said? I've not seen so great a faith in all of Israel. Very close to what Abraham did. When God told him to sacrifice Isaac, he never stopped. He had fully intended to carry it out because he had that confidence in Almighty God.
Right.
So here's a person that surprisingly has that level of faith. And just like Job, the Lord give it, the Lord take away, blessed be the name of the Lord.
Yeah, yeah. Now, what the centurion ends up saying is, you don't need to bother coming to my house. Just say the word. And what was his reasoning? How did he come to this conclusion? You don't need to come to my house.
He knew that this was God, and God could do anything.
Yeah. Centurion also knew, he said, I'm a man of authority. I have people underneath me. I know how it works. When my superiors tell me that I should do X, Y, Z, I'm going to do X, Y, Z, because that's what I'm supposed to do. He's delegating this authority to me, and I'm supposed to go do it. And he says the same thing happens whenever I tell my soldiers to go do this, or when I tell my servants to go do that. They do it. He understood how authority works and how delegation works and how the power of a word or a command works. That he didn't have to be there to lay hands on him. All he needed to do was to do what? What did he say? Speak the word. And that's when Jesus says, I'm paraphrasing here, whoa. I haven't seen faith like that even in Israel. What was Jesus saying? He was born in Israel. He'd been ministering in Israel. But he hadn't seen anyone who had that kind of faith. That sort of belief that it would merely take a command and he would be well. What wonderful faith this man ended up having. So, Jesus said, it'll be just as you asked. And so the friends went back to the house, and what did they discover? The paralyzed man, the man who was in such terrible pain, the man who was possibly close to death, was now in good health. He had been healed, all by the word. It wasn't necessary to go in the house. It wasn't necessary to lay hands. It wasn't necessary to do anything except for him to say, it'll be done. He'll be healed. important lesson. This was a really amazing thing to Jesus. And it ends up, I think, having some important teachings for us too about faith, that we need to be living by faith and realizing that if God says that it'll be done, it'll be done. And when He says He's going to answer our prayers, what do we need to assume? Prayers will be answered. Now, it is important to realize and understand that sometimes God's schedule is not our schedule. Have you noticed that before? God, I really want this blessing now. And there are times in which He does. He, to my embarrassment, I guess, I'll say I'm sometimes surprised. Whoa, that was quick. But there's other times He's answered prayer a few days or weeks or months down the road, maybe even years down the road, but He answers the prayer. And sometimes it is no, because I didn't need it. Anyone here besides me ever had a no answer from God and then later on discover that I'm really glad He said no? That would have been a big problem if I had had X, whatever it was.
But He knows when you need it and when it's feasible for it to be done.
Yeah.
If everything came just like that, somewhere down where we gonna fail.
Mm-hmm.
We take things for granted. We have to be careful about
Yeah.
what we ask for.
Yep.
It may not be what you want.
It may not be what we need, and it may actually do damage to us. Lord, I'd like to be really wealthy, but maybe God knows, no, you don't. No, you don't, because I know where that would lead you. There is this other thing in Scripture, right, that says that we will not be tempted beyond what we're able to bear. You ever wonder how that might end up actually playing into prayer? Maybe sometimes the reason that God says no is because He knows, I'm sorry, Park, you can't handle that. At least not right now. You're not going to be able to handle that. So the answer is going to be no, because I don't want you to be tempted beyond what you're able to bear. And so on. Well, anyway, our time is up. So next time we will pick it up here with the widow of Nain, or the dead son of the widow of Nain. And I appreciate all the great comments and questions that were asked. And if you're joining us online, we're grateful for your presence as well, and hope that you stick around for another 15 minutes. We're going to have worship then, and we'd love to have you join us. Thanks.